and that becomes a major deal. And it still is in the church today. The Roman Catholic tradition, the Orthodox tradition, the Anglican tradition all suggest that that line of apostolic succession has never been broken. And other churches, of course, it was broken. So I just want you to know, from an ecumenical standpoint, that is still an issue for us to this very day. And when we sit down and talks with other churches, like, for example, we're in a concordat with the Lutheran Church now, that always becomes a sticking issue for people, apostolic succession. I'm going to personally tell you, I think it is absolutely absurd to try to trace our roots back to Peter, because, of course, there were no priests then, and nothing happened then. And on the other side of that sheet, you will see a kind of historical background of the idea around papal succession. So we've got all these bishops in the church, okay? And there's only bishops. The Bishop of Rome is a bishop, just like all the other bishops in the church. And that's the way it stays. The authority of bishops becomes institutionalized around 250. And you see on that list a little bit of that history. The idea that Peter was a pope in the church has no historical documentation to it, of course. And no one was called a pope in the church until, I don't even remember what it says, something like, what? 384 was the first time somebody used that word, and it was not meant to be that a pope was different than any other bishop. That didn't happen until the 8th century, okay? So the whole idea of papal succession is kind of bizarre. We were well into the 8th century before anyone suggested that the Bishop of Rome was more important than any other bishop. Okay? And I'm not speaking out of school here. Roman Catholic scholars will tell you the same thing, real scholars. Okay? So there you go. All right, good? Good. All right. Okay. So, 4th century, 313. A guy named Constantine comes to power. Some of you probably heard about. And he has a religious experience on the battlefield. Does anybody know a little bit about that story, about Constantine? Mm-hmm. Okay. Anybody want to tell that story? I can shut up for a while.
The cross.
Yep.
And the dream.
Yep.
And he decided that would be the symbol for his army, and
Thank you.
He used that symbol.
Thank you. So Constantine's losing the battle, and suddenly in the background, as this is happening, he sees this image of a cross in the sky, and suddenly the battle turns, and they start winning. And Constantine comes out of that battle and says, "Wow, this is amazing. I think the Roman Empire needs to become Christian." And of course, that's how it always worked in those days. The leader chose what the religion of the empire or the country would be. So here we are, 315. Everything in the church changes. It went from being this tiny little cult to suddenly being not only accepted by the Roman Empire, but the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, there is much discussion about whether Constantine actually had a religious experience on the battlefield, or whether he saw this as a political means of making things come together in the empire. And most historians are split right down the center on this. And at least the last time I looked at these numbers, it was pretty much 50-50 out there. And we were asked to write about this in seminary, and we were 50-50 in our seminary class, almost exactly down. Half the people thought Constantine did this strictly for political reasons. Half people thought he really had a religious. So I have no idea, but it happened for whatever reason, and everything changes overnight. The church becomes imperial. So Constantine puts out the Edict of Milan. Suddenly the church has money and power and visibility and legitimacy. The bishop replaces the philosopher in the community. Christianity becomes responsible for the culture. So it is hard to imagine what kind of effect that had on the church and everybody. It was crazy. It became a wholly different thing. And to this day, some people will say that's when the church went bad. And other people will say, no, that's the only reason the church survived. So you take that for what it's worth too, but that's historically what happened. So Constantine says, all right, you guys, you are representing the Roman Empire now. You have to really define what it means to be a Christian. And so he took all of the bishops, and this is 325, and he locked them all in a room and said, you're not coming out until you define orthodoxy, until you define what it is, what it means to be a Christian. Anybody know what that room was, where that room was?
Nicaea.
Yep.
Nicaea.
Who said that?
Nicaea.
Yep. So that was the Council of Nicaea in 325. And they started this whole conversation again about how in the world we're going to call ourselves a monotheistic church when we believe in Jesus. So this is the first work around the Trinity and this idea of, you notice the word Trinity is not in the Bible. This conversation happened way, way, way later. And at the Council of Nicaea, the big word that kind of won the day was homoousios, a Greek word meaning of the same substance is the best way we could say it in English. And that was kind of the way they described how Jesus could be part of God, but also be a human being. There was a guy named Arius there, and Arius said there was once a time when the Son did not exist, the S-O-N, that Christ did not exist. He said that the Son is not begotten from God, and that if God is the only uncreated being, then there can't be two unbegottens. That was his way of describing this. There was another guy named Athanasius, and he said that the Father and Son shared the same nature. And at the beginning of this process, Athanasius was thrown into jail because of him saying such a ridiculous thing. And in the end, Athanasius won, and Arius got thrown into jail. Okay? So, the Nicene Creed that we have, that's where it came from. It came from those bishops locked in the room, writing these words down until they could agree that this is what we've got. Okay? I want you to remember that anytime you say the creed. It was answering the questions of the 4th century about what this was all about. Okay? It still wasn't settled. Okay? In 381, they had another council in Constantinople, and this discussion continues, and they actually finish the Council of Nicaea. And the guys that kind of won the day there were what would become the Orthodox Church, the Cappadocians, a guy named Basil and 2 Gregories. And they came up with this idea that there was one ousia, O-U-S-I-A, in 3 hypostasis. And so hypostasis, so the best way we could say that in English, I think, is that there are 3 modes of God in one nature. And that was the language that they used to describe how we were going to have a church that was still monotheistic but believed in these 3 different entities. We could spend months talking about just the Trinitarian controversies and how we got to this place. And that is a very, very general summary of what happened there. But we could spend lots of time with that. Okay? So can we go with that? All right.
Yes.
So, let's talk about Augustine of Hippo, in the Western Church. So after the Council in Constantinople, there's really two major theologies going on in the church. What I'm going to call the Eastern theology and the Western theology. And Basil and Gregory represented that Eastern thought. And Western thought became a conversation between two guys, Augustine of Hippo and Pelagius. And Augustine is the guy who said lots of things, but he believed in inherited original sin, meaning that all of us are stained with the sin of two historical people named Adam and Eve, and because of the sin that they created, that they took part in, that we read about in Genesis, that all of us are stained with this, and there's nothing that we can do about it. This is when the idea of double predestination began. That God's already decided who's in and who's out, and we're all stuck with this sin to begin with. Okay? Pelagius says, no. All of us have free will. Humans can all control their own destiny. Things are not predestined, and we do not have anything stained on us that we can't get rid of by some other way. Well, Pelagius again starts to win in that argument, and then it turns very much the other way, and Augustine wins. So,
He wins every year.
what's that? He wins every year?
He
Yeah.
wins every year.
He does win every year.
So does that mean that way of thinking requires a literal interpretation of the creation story?
Yes, absolutely.
So if you don't follow that
Right.
orthodoxy,
Thank you.
you have a problem.
Yep, exactly.
I like that.
Exactly. Yep. So that's an immediate problem. But this is a major issue, so I want to talk about this a little bit. So in the Western Church, inherited original sin becomes the big deal, and the only way to get that off of you is to be baptized. Okay? So baptism becomes very, very important. In the Eastern Church, original sin is understood in a very different way than in the West. In the Eastern Church, the thought process is original sin is the sin that we all commit. That as human beings, we all screw up. And they said, so here's our example. The first 4 stories in the Bible. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the flood, today's story, and the Tower of Babel. They all tell the same story, they say. Human beings screw up, they apologize, and God forgives them. They said that is what original sin is. It's the sin that we all commit. It's the fact that all of us are sinful by nature, and that we mess up. But in the end, God forgives us. Okay? So see the major difference there? The West is saying, you have this sin because these historical people did this thing, and it's stuck on your soul. And the Eastern Church is saying, no. Original sin just means that's the way we all sin. So baptism becomes a very different thing in both of those things, and that has stuck with us to this very day. Here's what I want you to hear. The Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church, has always been much closer to the Orthodox Church in the way we understand this. Okay? This is one of the major separators between the Roman Catholic tradition and the Anglican tradition. In the Roman Church, inherited original sin, get baptized, or else. Later, we're going to talk about purgatory and limbo and all those things, okay? We never bought into that. We were much more in the Orthodox line of thinking across this, okay?
When did that diversion take place? Because the Anglican Church evolved from the Catholic Church. When did that happen?
So we're going to talk about that in the class tomorrow and next week.
Okay.
So yeah, that's going to happen in the 16th century. Okay, is when that split will take place. But we were always much more Eastern in this. The Eastern-Western split doesn't happen until 1054, literally. But I'm telling you, it's already here in the 4th and 5th century. That's what's going on. We are already so theologically different, especially on that front. Okay? All right. Good. So, 5th century, Roman Empire collapses, right? Everything falls apart. We lose we lose society as we know it. The culture's gone. So the church really becomes the calm in a very chaotic world after Rome falls. The monks in the church are seen as spiritual leaders, and the world is very tripartite by the year 600. There's Christendom in the west, Byzantium in the east, and then the growing movement of the Islamic tradition. Okay, and the world's kind of broken into those three groups. Clans and kings, those kinds of societies are in the world now. The world is totally theocratic. The church and state are the same thing. Whatever the ruler of a country is, that's what the people are. This is the days of early feudalism. Population centers are totally burned over. The world is much more rural. The big cities are gone. And Christianity becomes the only real unifying force in that world. Christianity represents the Roman culture, and it holds all of that together. So those stories that you've heard about monks copying down all those books, handwriting all our Bibles, it's not just our religious books they do. They copy all of the books of Western culture, of Greek civilization. And without those monks, we would not have those today. But that's what the church becomes all about in those days. What the New World sees is a monastic church marked by learning and clerical elite folks. The clergy become the teachers of the culture and the bearers of the culture because everything else is gone. The clergy and the saints become the stability in a splintered culture, and this is when in popular religion miracle stories start, and there's a lot of talk about how individual saints do these magic things. This is all happening in this culture where people aren't reading anymore, and that becomes popular religion. The world looks to monastics and saints then for their faith because we're moving away from a literate culture, and the cult of saints becomes very much a part of Christian tradition. If you want to feel a little bit about what that's like, if you go to Mexico today, or even like northern New Mexico, you'll feel that cult of saints. What that kind of faith is like. That's very much the way it was in the early Middle Ages. Okay? Suffering and pain becomes a major part of life, so the saints become very important. It's kind of interesting that in the Western Church, dead saints are really important. After somebody dies, miracles are attributed to them, and that becomes the holy. But in the East, the holy is everywhere, can break at any time, and icons become the big deal. That's the entrance into the divine. Icons become the window to God. And that's how icons work. I should have brought, well, these are icons. So the whole idea of the iconic display is that you can have a window to God by looking through the icon. And if you look at any icon that's done well, no matter where you're standing, it looks like the icon is looking at you.
Yeah.
So the idea is that through that icon, you're able to reach to God. So it's that kind of popular thought process that becomes a major part of the church. It's only now that the West begins requiring clerical celibacy. Okay? We're in the 8th century. That's when clerical celibacy starts. Okay? In the 6th century, there begins a movement towards purity of clergy, and that becomes an issue because clergy have been set apart from the rest of the culture. In 561, women can't be deaconesses anymore, as this movement towards women being impure becomes stronger and stronger. Okay? So that's the direction that the church is going. Okay. So the access to the Bible is through educated clergy, and the church becomes the culture. This is also the time when the missions to England occur, and Pope Gregory starts those missions. Celtic spirituality starts to influence Christianity. This observance of the natural world and solitude and pilgrimages become a part of Christianity. Fasting and discipline and repentance and penitential actions become part of what's happening in the church. So by the end of the 6th century, penance is really a big deal in the church. And church administration is moving more and more towards the monasteries and away from the bishop or the diocese. And that culture begins to come about in lots of forms. And I will skip over some of that, taking us to the year 800, when Charlemagne is emperor, and Charlemagne is crowned by the Pope. So the Pope has now gone from being a bishop among equals, the Bishop of Rome, to now actually crowning the emperor. And the Pope has as much power in the world by this time as anyone else. He just doesn't have his own army, and that will change soon too. So Charlemagne conquers territories and Christianizes them. He builds churches, he establishes schools, he invites scholars to come, and this is when we have the building of the Second Rome. The church becomes uniform, everybody's doing it the same way, liturgies start to be the same everywhere that you go in the church, and the bishops are now depending on local nobility for protection, and the Roman Church is now a very European church, and the church and state are obviously one. Okay? Good? Okay, so as we start to move into the Middle Ages, the coronation of kings are modeled on Episcopal consecrations. So you see, it's all the same thing. So when a bishop is consecrated, it looks just like when an emperor is brought into office. It all starts to appear the same. There are 3 orders of people in the world at this time. There are fighters, workers, and prayers. So there's this big separation between clergy and laity, and that's growing even more and more. Everybody has their little job and they do it. So clergy begin people that pray for you and do everything for you, and we get all this stuff about priests being the way that you get to God. So this is building in the 9th and 10th century. Monasticism is in full bloom by the 9th century. Becomes the major part of the church. That sort of religious life is the most important thing that's going on. Private penance becomes very big instead of public, as in the early church. And this is the time when we're doing religion for people, okay? The masses become non-participatory because the priest is supposed to be praying for you. You have other jobs. So the priest starts doing that for you, and that starts building. We have all these votive masses and feast days and saint days where the priest does prayers for the dead. And this is the time when the celebrant starts to whisper the Eucharistic prayer. You know what I mean? You know what the Eucharistic prayer is? Part of the service leading us into communion. The priest starts whispering it because it's in Latin. The people in the pews have no idea what the priest is saying. The people are so disconnected from what's going on that they're not, that they don't understand anything that's happening. So the priest just kind of says it to himself while everybody just sits there praying their rosaries because they don't know what's going on. And they can't understand it anyway, even if they did. So this is also when the debate starts on whether Eucharist is actually the body of Christ or is symbolic. That conversation starts to happen here. Relics become a major form of exchange. Canonization begins at this point, and now we are using unleavened bread instead of real bread. That doesn't happen until the 11th century. The host starts to be treated as a relic, that it's venerated and holy and pure. People become so separated from the clergy and the sacrament that they begin to feel unworthy to take communion because we're not good enough to do all of this. So the priest is up there doing all this stuff. And there's also a screen between the priest and the people. It's called a rood screen, and it's got little tiny holes in it, and the people are peering through to see what's happening in the screen, and the priest is back there doing all this stuff. And what happens? We ring bells in the church when certain moments happen, when we get to the moments of high drama, when we are consecrating the bread and the wine. And what does the priest say at that moment? He holds up the host and he says, "Hoc est corpus."
Hocus
Where
pocus.
we get the words today, hocus pocus. This has become so separated from the people that people have no idea what's going on, and the only time they pay any attention is when somebody rings the bells at the consecration, and then the priest goes hoc est corpus and holds this up. So much so that if you're walking down the street outside the cathedral and you hear the bells ring, you drop to your knees. Okay? That's what liturgy, that's what the church became by the 11th and 12th century.